right, we're ready to get started again. So we've got another great session, sort of continuing the theme of power and sustainability. So this one we're looking at, besides targets and pledges, how is the data center community measuring sustainability? This is shaping up to be another great session. It's being led by Jason McGee-Abe, who's the Global TMT lead for 26.5. Jason, take it away.
Thank you very much, James, and thank you everyone for joining us on such an important and critical component that we're all fighting against at the moment. I'm really thrilled to be joined by such an illustrious panel, to be honest. The names on the screen and the weight of experience that these guys all have is going to be hopefully leading to an amazing conversation. So besides targets and pledges, how is the data center community measuring sustainability? Now, scope 3s, we're definitely wanting to touch on that. It's a very hard one to measure. One person's scope is a different scope to another's. And, you know, this is a huge problem that we're all facing, and time's running out. You know, we had PUE. It took a long time to develop that. So we'll certainly touch on all these important subjects. If there are questions at the end, please do raise your hand. We'll send a mic round. But with that, I'd just like to kind of welcome the guests again. If we can go down first, and if you could all respectively introduce yourself and just give one example, if you may, of one initiative that your company is dealing with in regards to measuring sustainability at the moment. So, Aaron, if I could start with you, please, and we'll make our way down.
Hopefully everyone can hear me. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Aaron Binkley, the Vice President of Sustainability for Digital Realty. So in terms of sustainability, one of the areas, and I suspect we'll dig into this quite a bit more as the session continues, is really starting to look at our Scope 3 emissions and start looking at life cycle carbon assessments. So understanding what is going into our data center designs, how are we constructing them, and what are the opportunities to make efficiency improvements there to reduce carbon further. So we started life cycle assessments across different portions of our portfolio, and we can dig into that a little bit more as we discuss further.
And I'm Chris Wellis. I'm the Vice President of Sustainability for Equinix. And, you know, very similar to Aaron, I think we're all sort of, you know, our peers, competitors, everyone in the industry is really focused on the data problem around sustainability. So for me, I always like to simplify things. It's about map, measure, and reduce. I think we've all largely accomplished the mapping phase, and now we're really digging into that measurement phase. We approach it from both the supply and demand side. So from a supply side, one of the things that we've accomplished is we've achieved matching of 96% renewable energy across our total global portfolio.
Perfect. And Dean, representing Infrastructure Masons, but also Cato Digital.
Yeah, Dean Nelson, Chairman and Founder of Infrastructure Masons. I have the pleasure of actually hanging out with these people. And we put together the Climate Accord specifically to be able to have these companies all focus on a single target to accelerate the timeline to get to carbon neutrality, and then, of course, to get to net zero. But with all the power behind this, we've got over 200 companies that represent over $6 trillion in market cap. That's a lot of buying power. So putting the money where the mouth is to drive that down. What I love about my role is I also run a startup company called Cato Digital, and we're going after Scope 3 directly, and that's in equipment. So we have low cost, low carbon compute. It's all second life equipment going into data centers using wasted capacity and renewable energy. So we're trying to hit all three of those elements to drive that back down. Now the measurement around that, we can do that because we understand what the history of the origin is of the equipment. We do the material mapping of the building of the data center, and then we look at the source energy.
And Josh?
I'm Josh Snowhorn. I'm the founder and CEO of Quantum Loophole. We're a little bit unusual in that we actually don't build data centers. We provide land, energy, water, and fiber. to support the industry and have everything kind of shovel ready or deployment ready. Our sustainability focus, we acquired a former Alcoa aluminum smelter that was highly polluted. It's a brownfield site with cyanide and fluoride in the soil and all these other terrible things that nobody would ever want to put a home on, but it's perfect for data centers. So that's reclamating land. We consider that a sustainable function. We're using existing transmission scale power lines that are already there for the smelter, so that's a sustainable function. We don't have to build new lines. We have 7 million gallons of gray water that runs by our campus every day. It goes into the Potomac River, which is right behind us. I probably wouldn't drink the water, but that gray water is treated sewage water, which we can use for cooling, so that's a sustainable function. We even have a mine and the ability to produce cement for the 28 million square feet of data center space that'll be on our campus right next door to us. So that'll be transported right there. Rail line going through for transport of generators or batteries or anything else. So for us, we're part of the Climate Accord, and I love Dean and what he's done, and I think it's great because he's kind of centralized and got everybody into a good focus. I love that standard. What we do uniquely is bring together, putting our money where our mouth is essentially, and trying to get everybody a nice base layer of pure sustainable land, water, energy, so they can go do what they want to do and meet all the different scopes they want to achieve.
Excellent. And over to yourself, Joe.
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm Joe Reale, Vice President, a Solution Architect at Schneider Electric. We take sustainability very seriously. I think we're #1 in the world, sustainable. Couple things that we find it really important is that all of these folks up here, and many of you, purchase equipment. And what we've decided to do is, for every piece of equipment we have, there's a life cycle analysis been done. You mentioned that before, and a product environmental profile comes along with the circuit breaker, with switchgear, with UPSs and so on, helping our clients understand kind of what they're purchasing and having a look at it. Secondly, we're a strong force in the global sustainable data center environment. So a couple of white papers coming out and heavily involved with Dean and the iMasons. 23 metrics we've proposed to measure sustainability and metrics. We're actually, because of the Climate Accord and all of the work that we're doing with the larger community, there's going to be version 2 coming out with that white paper, and we're going to actually move it up to 27 metrics now, I think.
Well, thank you again for joining, guys. Chris mentioned something about sort of data and kind of simplifying things. So here are some kind of numbers for everyone. So 7 million data centers, 105 gigawatts of capacity, consuming 594 terawatt hours of energy. That's 2.4% of the global energy consumption. Now, concrete, steel, aluminum, sorry, I'm in the US now, responsible for nearly a quarter of the total global carbon emissions. So this is a huge area. We have a huge responsibility to fix this. We mentioned scope 3s. So I'd love to hear from the panelists and your experience talking to your customers, kind of your kind of peers in the industry. It's a difficult area. How are we greening the supply chain? Anyone want to dig in there? Dean, do you want to jump in first?
Yeah, I think that we got to look at carbon accounting holistically, and this is the reason we brought everybody back together. We came up with a simple strategy to make it clear for people to say, these are the buckets in which I'm measuring. So the first one is the materials themselves. That's the concrete, steel, copper, et cetera, that's in the buildings, right? Then you've got the equipment that goes in, as Joe was saying, like the electrical distribution, the mechanical, right, all those elements, including the IT equipment, networking pieces. Then you have the source energy that is actually consumed. So the first two are the embodied carbon, and they are the primary aspects of scope 3. Okay, and so I look at, we've got to have a way to be able to say, I can put a simple carbon label on that building that sums up the materials, the equipment inside of it, and the actual power that's being consumed. So that's what we're trying to get down to. But the only way to do that is to have some type of maturity model that shows people what they can do. Because right now we got people that are very advanced in this. I think that some of the companies that have done this from a actual end user consumption standpoint, you look at the Googles and the Metas and the Microsofts and all them, they've done a ton of work in capturing and calculating that. So they're ahead in the maturity curve. But there's a lot of people that are just getting started, they're not sure what to do. And that's what this is about, is we've got a maturity model working group that's starting to measure that aspect. But I will say that probably one of the most exciting things for me is a company called Building Transparency, nonprofit. They have gone back and now started measuring specific projects with specific materials in specific locations with specific sourcing, and they can tell you what the embodied carbon footprint is of that building. That's public. And it's a database that allows you to be able to now say, I want to go look at this address. Here's the embodied carbon footprint of the building. So the materials are covered. And like you said, 17% of the embodied carbon is concrete. It's huge. And so when you look at steel, it's the second biggest one, and then all the other materials. But being able to have a source that you can go reference, that's the construction people, the actual suppliers of the materials, are all putting this back into this kind of a database. To me, that's where we can really start moving it, because what you can measure, you can actually change. But we have to have a way to do that. Now we have a guide that people can follow to be able to do that from the material side.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Dean is touching on some interesting points. I think there's a really, Jason, something in your opening statement, though, which is interesting, which is that 2.5% number. I've been doing this for a number of years, and I remember back in my Hewlett-Packard days, all the projections were that data centers were going to be consuming 10% or more of the world's energy. People probably remember hearing about that. And it was really, I almost liken it to, in the early days of sort of the focus on point sources of pollution, you go after the smokestacks, you go after the discharge points, because it's an easy way to target a specific element of where pollution is occurring. And I felt like, to a large extent, the spotlight was really on data centers, but a lot of the data is wrong. There's a great article published, peer-reviewed journal article in the journal Science, I think it was about a year and a half ago now, which showed that all of the energy efficiency improvements that occurred actually bent that curve way down. We've achieved nowhere near, despite the proliferation of data, we're at 2.5% total energy consumption, not the 10 that was projected. So I think all of the energy efficiency improvements that have occurred and innovations that have occurred over the last decade or so have really showed that innovation can drive down energy consumption. I think now we're entering this inflection point, which is what Dean is really focused on, which is we can't ignore energy efficiency improvements, but we do need to look at scope 3. Everything else, all of the other component level carbon that goes into the data center infrastructure, we're going to need to figure out where the hotspots are and how to drive the carbon out of those hotspots. And I think that's some of the work that Dean's driving forward, which is great to see.
Joe, if I can go to you, actually, Schneider, sustainability, you've really been seen as a leader in that respect. So those early conversations over the years, how have you been developing that? How have you been continuing that conversation to make sure that everyone is on board? They know that this is serious. They need to tackle this area.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think it's quite easy to get people on board nowadays. I mean, it's not hard to get people on board for the sustainability push anymore. I think it's quite easy. I think, one of the things I want to go back a little bit, you mentioned something at the beginning, I think. I barely heard you. I think you said 2.6% of the world's energy. Okay, look, I think I'd like to compartmentalize this discussion, two things. There's a greenfield, and then there's a brownfield. And in a brownfield, we're not going to take a big bulldozer and bulldoze it, build it with bamboo panels, right? Okay, so we have to start to address greenfields and brownfields differently a little bit, right? Okay, and so we have co-location providers up here. I used to work at a big giant bank. I would populate their data centers with all kinds of IT equipment and refresh it every 3 years. It's complicated for them, it's complicated for us, scope 3, how we're measuring all that stuff, right? So I think when you tackle a brownfield, I think you have to look at 4 levers on how to deal with the brownfield data center. First is utility, pretty simple. Carbon, coal versus renewable green. You could change the sustainability of the data center overnight without touching inside. Second is going to be the IT kit. It refreshes every 3 years. Third is going to be, call it the MEP equipment. Same thing. But for every 5 times that an IT server is replaced, a generator or a chiller or a UPS is replaced. 3 years to 10 to 15 years, right? And then the biggest challenge is going to be how all of it operates both ways. The IT equipment is operating. There's a lot of inefficiency there completely, okay? And then the MEP equipment's operating too. Those are the 4 levers that you look at when you're really looking at a brownfield data center and how to address that. The challenge is going to be in the co-location world, who counts that? Who counts that? Is it the end user's equipment that's going in, that's on their books, or is it on Digital Realty's books or Equinix books, or is it on both? And the answer, I think it's on both for a reason. So
I think this is a great conversation. I want to touch on what Chris and Dean in particular said around think about data and thinking about kind of the challenge of embodied carbon. Now, you can't look at a piece of steel and know if it's low carbon steel. It looks exactly the same. It functions exactly the same. The specifications are exactly the same. Same thing with concrete. The same thing with the products. So having accurate data about what the components and what the constituency of that item is critically important. And having that consistently across all the SKUs, if you will, that go into the construction of a data center. Everything from the concrete and steel of the base building, the core and shell, all the way through to the fit out of all the products, the conduits, the cabling, all the cooling infrastructure, the electrical infrastructure that goes into that building. Having that all is critical. And so in terms of, Dean, your maturity model concept, I think that's critically important because those SKUs don't all have EPDs or PEPs as it stands today. And I know Schneider's been working very hard to lead the industry on identifying that for all their products, but not every single manufacturer has that available. So if I want to go and create a truly comprehensive life cycle assessment embodied carbon model of my data center with every SKU in that building, I probably can't do that today. I have to make certain assumptions, I have to make some estimates, and in some cases I can get really good data, in some cases I can't. And that's part of that evolution, that's part of that maturity, is to get that missing data, to start to fill in those blanks. And as soon as you have that information, you can start to make smarter choices around improving your embodied carbon footprint. But ultimately, you won't be able to see it in the products. We're not going to see plants on the wall to signify a low carbon building. The wall's going to look exactly the same as it did before. So that data and that story around the data is critically important.
Sure. So I was lucky in my career to start out at Terramark, which was acquired by Verizon and now belongs to Equinix. And I built Napa the Americas down in Miami, 750,000 square foot building with 130 megawatts. We opened it in June of 2001. Just built it as fast as we could, and it was great. But did we ever think about sustainability or carbon or anything then? It wasn't even slightly a conversation. Didn't exist. Just didn't matter. And that was the biggest data center from the grounds up in the world at the time. Now, all we do is think about that from the grain of dirt that we're moving to materials coming in, where are the trucks being delivered from, how much fuel are they burning, where is our water coming from? Water is a huge subject that is going to be a big issue. Not only is water an issue because of chilled water systems, but as people go to dry coolers, when there is no water, that just takes more electricity. So you start to, again, have another sustainability issue. And I loved how you mentioned aluminum. That was really awesome because our site's a former aluminum smelter. So I need to calculate the benefit that we got from taking all that carbon out. But our site had 2.5 gigawatts of power, and Alcoa shut it down because the cost of electricity was too high in Maryland for their particular use, competing with Chinese aluminum. And there was just no possibility. They only have 3 smelters in the country now. That's it. So they're declining as a business, but unfortunately that business, if it goes offshore, it goes to countries where the carbon rules are almost don't exist in some cases, and that's why they have cheap electricity and can spew smoke and it doesn't matter. So our world, because we don't actually build the buildings and we're supplying everybody whose goals have to achieve these, including multi-tenants and hyperscale providers, we just have to get as baseline as we can on soil, energy, water, materials, adjacent delivery. As I mentioned earlier, having cement produced literally mined actually aggregate mined across the street and cement produced across the street. We could almost belt it with 28 million square feet of buildings across the street. That's pretty cool because that means trucks aren't running and we do things like that. So we just try and stay very baseline on that and again, put our money where our mouth is in producing these materials and things for the clients coming in.
It's a really interesting point, and you mentioned water there as well. And digital realty, I know, for example, you guys are looking into your new sort of designs for data centers to really show how you don't have to rely on it as much. And I love how what Josh is doing in terms of that sort of renewable water supply, and you're kind of reversing that cycle of this whole conversation from sustainability, right from the source all the way back into the process. So I'd love to hear from Digital Realty and Equinix in terms of how are you actually designing, how are you looking to actually embed these new principles of you don't have to rely so much on things like water in the new facilities?
Yeah, maybe I'll start. So in terms of water specifically, critical issue become much more important very recently, but it's always been, I think, percolating along in the background. So from a water standpoint, since 2013, our standard designs have been water-free cooling. So very low reliance on water. And in fact, in those buildings, landscape irrigation is typically the largest consumer of water, followed by potable water uses inside the facility for kitchens and toilets and things like that. So the cooling systems themselves, water-free. And with advances in free cooling and other cooling system optimizations, you're not really paying much of a penalty in terms of PUE. So you're really getting the best of both worlds. Additionally, wherever we can connect to gray water or municipally reclaimed water systems, we do that. And globally, about a third of the water that we do use comes from non-potable, reclaimed, or recycled water systems. So that water use is not depleting groundwater aquifers, it's not taking away potable water that's available for the communities. So those are critically important initiatives around the responsible use of water. And as we look at our designs going forward, that becomes critical to our continued progress on the design front, both from an efficiency and water efficiency, performance perspective, and also as we look at it more holistically around the total impact of the design for our new data centers.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think as I'm hearing Aaron talk, I mean, one of the things that sort of strikes me, and which is true for all of these issues, is there's a regional locality dimension to this, right? So when you look at, for instance, the use of low carbon materials, low carbon concrete, cementous replacement materials are different. You don't want to ship massive amounts of metric tons of concrete because it's low carbon in one location to another. Water's the same, right? So there are water-stressed regions and water-plentiful regions across the planet. For instance, if you look at the northwest of the United States, it's very water-plentiful. Places like South Africa or Sub-Saharan Africa are not. So one of the things that we do is we map across our fleet to understand where those regions of water stress occur. And then implement some of the features that Aaron mentioned, such as using reclaimed water where you can. One of the really interesting technologies that we're employing in Northern Europe is around using the aquifer to store from an energy perspective, because water has a high energy capacity. You could actually inject cold water into the aquifer, have a no net loss policy, extract some of that water when needed in the warmer periods of time. And we're also exploring liquid cooling technologies where you have essentially almost like a radiator system at the back of the rack of the server unit, and you have no net loss of water through those systems. So deploying those, but I think it's important again to really look at, from a regional perspective, where is water an issue? And then focus on those technologies there. Where it's plentiful, maybe there are other issues in those areas that you want to focus on.
Yeah, by the way, I love being on this panel because these are people that actually get shit done, pardon my French. That's so important. This is not just about the talk, it's the action to go back and do this. And I want to give 2 shout outs on this. Josh is onto something incredibly important. And the reason for that is that we are measuring, or we have 2 parts of carbon accounting that are not actually measured. So Joe Cava at Google came up with a concept of, we have GAAP accounting, right? General practices of this. But we really need cap accounting. Remove the unit of a dollar and replace it with metric tons of CO2e. And it has to add to 100. So no double counting, no greenwashing aspects of it. Literally is accounting of those pieces. But there's two factors in that we don't consider. Josh just mentioned he's building a large campus, 2.3 gigawatts.
We have 2.5 gigawatts at peak grid, but we can probably, and I'll get into it, we can probably get up to 10 gigawatts if we start producing power on site. So it's insane.
This is scale. This is what I love. But what's important about that is you've built a massive campus. He's concentrated the concrete creation, the fiber, it's removing all the transportation. So think about all the avoidance that's happening. We don't measure that. Okay, we happen to actually do this, but you don't get any credit for it. And he should get credit, but he's doing the right thing because it just makes good business sense. It's about scale and efficiency of doing these things together. So that's the first one. The second is that we don't talk about time. So Joe mentioned you've got 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. The building is 30, 50 years. So if you look at it, even though concrete is 17% of the carbon, it's for that moment in time, but it's distributed over 50 plus years. So the largest embodied carbon, or just carbon overall, is the IT equipment. Why? Because during that life of that data center, you refresh that thing 5 to 10 times. So that's just a whole bunch of a continuous embodied carbon in it. But we don't get any credit for saying, well, what if we extend the life of that? It's like the depreciation is ended, you get zero book value for it, but in the end of it, you don't get any other credit. So there's no measurement around that. So Chris Crosby over Compass Data Centers has this concept called Scope 4, just because there's a lack of a term for it. But we have to really dig down into say, how do we truly do 100% carbon accounting, but still take into account things like what Josh is doing. But the other side is now think of on-site generation. What Equinix is doing. There's Bloom fuel cells that are its primary power within data centers in Santa Clara in the middle of Silicon Valley. We're generating power because there's no more power. There's a forcing function for this. That is very efficient. Then you start to look at other sequestration options for the natural gas. You can start to get down to really, really, really low carbon. But this is what I mean is you're thinking of creative ways and holistic measures. That is what we have to have. If we don't, it's just a bunch of greenwashing and double counting. Just like we're doing with carbon credits. Show me the math. Show me the numbers, right? Just like you'd have an accountant come in and actually audit your books. We need the same thing in carbon accounting.
You said show me the math there, so let's move it on to show me the money. So from a financial perspective, how much do you all respectively think that is having a big influence on this industry when it comes to things like financial institutions, private equity firms, wanting you to prove your sustainable credentials in order to back you? So, I mean, what are your respective thoughts on that, Josh?
So the capital world is in buckets. We're invested by TPG, which is a $200 and some odd billion fund, but our assets under management. But they have a variety of funds. They have their RISE fund that's invested in sustainable ventures, Form Energy's iron flow batteries, various other technologies. The fund that invests in us is TPG's real estate fund. They care that we turn that real estate into money and a profit. However, their sustainable reporting as an organization is tremendous and actually made us pay attention. Oh, we have to meet these standards for sustainable reporting, which we technically weren't doing because it wasn't really what our asset was about. They required it. So the financial world is definitely paying attention to that, but at the same time, they're out for a profit. And those profits, if they can see a way to make money sustainably, they will. But if not, they're going to, believe me, the same funds are investing in oil and gas and some of the dirtiest things in the world as it goes. So it really does, it depends.
Joe, why don't we bring you back in? What are your thoughts in terms of how much finance, money, backed kind of institutions are sort of forcing people to change?
It's out there for sure, right? I mean, if you have the ESG, I think I read the stat. I think it's 4 or 5% lower cost if you have a very good sustainable program as your company. But something that's I thought maybe somebody would mention here, the The Security and Exchange Commission passed a law in 1930. Hasn't changed since then until now. There's a proposal in Congress right now that any publicly traded company has to report greenhouse gas and sustainability stuff coming. It's no longer going to be an option. In order for you to be publicly traded, you're going to have to disclose that. So folks like Digital, Equinix, Schneider, all of us, right? So guess what? There has to be a standard metric to do that. There has to be a standard way to go about doing that. So number one, again, money's pushing in, and if you're not sustainable or at least moving that direction, it's going to cost you more, and you might not get any. Okay, and then I'm really encouraged. We're going to have a metric. It's non-debatable. The question is, which ones are they? And they need to be standardized, at least in the United States, to comply with the law, right? So I think that's coming. I'd like to maybe hear from Aaron what you think about that, or is that on your guys' radar? Are you thinking about what's coming with that?
Yeah, we certainly are. We're very focused on coming regulations. I think they cut both ways. And in one way, it's obviously an additional burden, additional requirements. And when we look at what's coming in the U.S. versus what's coming in Europe, which might be coming in other markets around the world, there's just an acronym soup of regulations and requirements. So that's a risk area. Getting that stuff harmonized, making sure it's not just overhead and work and paper pushing. On the flip side, to the extent there is standardization and harmonization across industries, across sectors of the economy, around how carbon is reported, how it's managed, how it's measured, what's in, what's out, how do you make sure that there's no gaps, that you're not leaving out certain sectors. Regulation is really one of the better ways to achieve that standardization. Everyone reports under US GAAP for accounting. There's consistency, there's standardization there. And you can argue all day whether it's perfect or not, but it's standard, everyone understands it, and you can measure and work with it. And I think that's critically important because there is, especially with Scope 3, I've had colleagues in the past say it's not 3 scopes, it's really 5 or 6 or 7 scopes. When you unpack it, they're so wildly different. You could look at your leased corporate office space, that's Scope 3. Downstream leased assets, so what your customers' energy consumption is in your buildings could also be Scope 3. Your supply chain, your contractors' emissions could be your Scope 3. So wildly different things all fall into this catch-all Scope 3 bucket. And getting further definition, further clarity around that will be critically important. Otherwise, companies will make their own decisions about what they count and what they don't.
Yeah, just sort of building a little bit on what Aaron's saying. I mean, I think there's one really important component too that we shouldn't forget, which is, and I think a lot of really great points are mentioned. So I see really 3 kind of key elements here. The first is the accounting, which we're all talking about, and Joe mentioned the fact that GAAP accounting has been around for over 100 years. Greenhouse gas accounting is 15 or so years old. It's led by the WRI primarily, small NGO. We need to see some movement, I think, on the accounting side, some standardization. So it's great to see the work that Dean is doing. The second element is really around engagement. So one of the things that we really need to do is make sure that we're talking the same language to all of our suppliers. We're communicating and signaling sort of the same demand signals to our suppliers. And also innovation. I mean, it's predicted that about half the technologies to decarbonize our supply chains don't exist today. You're seeing some really interesting flows of capital into new innovations. Bottom line is we're going to need to develop all of the low carbon components and assemblies of the future. That's what we're going to buy as big companies. So how do we send those demand signals out to our suppliers? How do we agree on how we're going to account for those low carbon components? And then how do we continue to drive those new innovations into our supply chain so those materials are available for all of us as we continue to grow? Yeah,
and that's so spot on. I want I want to make a point in this, and I don't know if I'll ruffle some feathers, but the reason we brought these people together on the climate accord is that we're not moving fast enough. And if we wait for standards, we're going to be dead. It'll happen, but we have to move things via money. So to me, there's two sides of this coin. The first one was, think back, 2001, when you built that data center. Wasn't on any investor's mind. It's like, oh, okay. And then think 10 years ago. I started my sustainability journey at Sun Microsystems in 2008. That's when I first learned about how this all kind of comes together. And they said, well, you have to address ecology and economics. And it can't be an or, it has to be an and. It can be a sustainable, low-cost, efficient solution. It can be, it should be. But the difference that's happened literally in the last 5 years is where the money's coming from. So two factors have changed the entire game. Public commitments from the biggest companies in the world that they're going to achieve net zero. Public commitments. They don't know how they're going to get there. But they did the commitment because the only way to do that is everybody's scope 3, you have to work together. You have to. So for example, what Schneider is doing, they're publishing all of their PEPs, or what's are called EDPs, which are actually an ISO standard about carbon accounting on components, products. So the fact that 95% of your secure power products are public, there's Schneider equipment in almost every data center in the world. So all of a sudden, you've got accounting like that. But I think the most important part is the buying side now is going to drive the behavior. And it's not about saying, look at how much stuff we've moved around this. It literally is, I'm buying this, it's in my contracts, it's in my RFPs, it's in my specs. If I do that, that'll drive the other side. But remember, we didn't just put the hyperscalers in the climate accord. We brought the hyperscalers, 85 co-location companies, equipment manufacturers, all that together as an ecosystem, because that's the only way we're going to move it. And then behind all that, investors are requiring sustainable projects. No longer a nice to have, but the money will be actually given if you can achieve those sustainability goals. So for us, it was about urgency, and we're just not moving fast enough. We got to go lead with our wallet. And this is a massive consortium of buying power, and we will do that. And that will lead to the standards that we're going to be able to do the level of gap accounting, right, for carbon, at least in my perspective.
Joe, do you want to go? Josh first.
Yeah, so some interesting phrases you've heard. We talked about brownfield in respect to brownfield land or brownfield buildings. You've heard greenwashing mentioned. Liquid cooling was mentioned. All of these things tie back to an issue really in our energy world. There's embodied carbon within the concrete of the buildings. There's the material, the conduit, whether that's recycled or not, recycled steel, and all the components and guts that go into that, and how far it was transported. But in the energy world that actually drives our data centers, where we're trying to co-locate them next to these internet exchanges, we're reaching a phrase called peak grid. You guys remember peak oil, when there was no more oil and it was all going to be downhill from here, and they continually find more oil? Well, peak grid is a little bit different. You can build more transmission lines to actually support that, but and we want to take in renewable power like solar and wind, but there's a problem with that. The sun shines and the wind blows, and then it doesn't. So we have to build a multi-trillion-dollar grid to support this peak load, and that's why PJM, the marketplace we're in now, has stopped new interconnections. And so what that's going to start driving is microgrids, which is another phrase you've heard. Now, there's a regulatory framework around that to be able to support energy production adjacent to your actual use. And now, what is that energy production? Is that burning hydrogen? Well, that economy actually is fake. It doesn't exist right now. There's only been one gas turbine burning hydrogen in our country, and it was a 5% injection from tanker trucks. And that was in the middle of the country. So there's a capability, but the economy doesn't exist. Is it natural gas and scrubbing? Well, that's if you capture all your carbon, maybe you achieve those goals, but you're still burning, a carbon asset to create that electricity. Are you going to pop up small modular nuclear reactors? Would you guys want that in your backyard? Anybody? Let's see. We got one hand. All right. So one person likes radiation. So is a friend of mine too. But we're in a very weird world right now when it comes to sustainability. Is that we have table stakes that we must all achieve that didn't exist. The sustainable officer didn't exist years ago when I built Napa of the Americas, for example. Now we have these table stakes we must achieve, but there's so many cascading layers to drive all of it. At last point on liquid cooling, which was mentioned, liquid cooling is going to create a 10 to 20x densification of the data center, which requires more electricity to support that. It's wonderful for brownfield buildings that can be retrofitted to support liquid cooling, but how are you going to get the juice there to actually support that? We are just about at peak grid, and I would proffer that's one of our biggest problems.
Joe, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just want to say one thing. I think somebody mentioned this, and I thought it was really important. What I think drives the market is actually the clients, buyers. Buyers are if the buyer said, I'm not buying something unless I understand the full life cycle analysis of that product and the PEP, that would drive the market. But it's 3 bids and a buy. The lowest cost, procurement and sustainability aren't lined up. I deal with this all over the place. I'm not picking on anybody here, okay? Procurement's not lined up with the sustainability team. Procurement's the old 3 bids and a buy, the lowest cost. The operation team screams because it doesn't really work at the end. Somebody's got to integrate it. I really think, honestly, to be provocative, if you want to make change quickly, it comes from all of you. It comes from the clients. If the clients start to demand, I'm not buying unless, fill in the blank, guess what people like us would do? We're going to fill in the blank. Okay? So maybe the tail is in the wrong place here. Maybe we're asking the wrong people to do things. Maybe we need to ask the people that are buying to start to mandate what it is. Because when they do that, there won't be somebody not green saying, well, we don't have to do that. Because if you want to compete, everybody's going to have to do that, right? So that's just a provocative statement. Look, let's quit being the old way. You want to be new? Then we need to change the way we do things. Okay? And we're very, very, very slow to do that. Okay? Dean's organization is going to be great. What Josh is doing is great. These two are world leaders. We look up and admire and respect them. But there's 50,000 other companies that need to get on board and start to drive it. If they drive it, the industry changes overnight. If you wait for Schneider and other people to drive it, somebody's going to go, well, I'm not sure I'm going to buy the green one. I'm going to buy this blue one because of whatever. So that's a provocative statement, everybody. And for those that know me, you knew it was coming.
Yeah. I'd love to bring Chris back into this because you, prior to Equinix, you were at Amazon Web Services and heading up sustainability efforts there, and where really drove a sort of customer tool to really sort of look into the amount of emissions across the sort of chains, so that they could just log in, have a quick look. I mean, could you explain a little bit more about that? I mean, it was interesting that Joe mentioned seeing it from the customer point of view, the buyer point of view. So give us a little bit of insight into that, if that's okay. Just we've got about 5 minutes left. But
yeah, sure. I'll try to be brief. Well, you've heard it throughout the entire panel today. The fact that it's really a data problem, right? So a lot of, just like most business problems, sustainability really is also sort of a data problem as well, right? So providing customers with the right information to drive the right behavioral change is super important. So at Equinix, one of the things that we do is we provide a green power report to all of our customers based upon their usage of our services. So they get a location-based and a market-based carbon footprint associated with their Equinix usage. I think that's going to need to evolve over time. So we really provide high degrees of granularity and options so that they can actually perhaps switch workloads if they need to, or move to full hybridization if that's going to help to drive down their environmental impacts. So again, I think making sure that we're giving customers what they need from an information perspective to drive the right behaviors is important. And just one of the last comments that I want to make too is we're really focused on the impacts, the negative impacts, I think, of our industry. I think it's also important to note all of the beneficial, positive impacts that we have. I mean, data centers, run workloads that optimize airline travel. They provide all of, the back end for healthcare services. They're providing compute loads for the smart factory floors of the future, automated driving. We haven't even gotten to, and I think you touched on sort of scope 4, but all the amazing things that occur through the compute, storage, networking. We haven't even touched on AI. So I think the possibilities are really limitless in terms of beneficial impacts. It's really important, obviously, to focus on, hey, how do we get our backyard in order first? But I think we should also keep things in context and keep in mind all of the amazing things that these technologies are driving out in the world at large as well.
Absolutely. And generative AI and the impacts of that, I think that's an entirely different panel that you could have in its own right. Just a final note, if I may, it's quite clear that there's a huge need for a unified metric. Just like with PUE and the green grids and how that was driven not from regulatory sort of sources, it was very much the industry coming together. PUE got established, that helped us measure things, it helped us judge our performance. There should be, there's lots of debates about whether we should have further iterations and, in terms of how you report differently still. But the main thing is that took, a long time relatively to put together. We don't have that now. So can we finish off with, we'll open it up for a question or two, but Dean, can you just, all the companies here together, we've got over 200 companies that have come together with the Climate Accord. Every panelist on the stage is a member. So Dean, tell us a little bit more about the Climate Accord. Why should everyone sign up?
Yeah, it's a cool group of people, by the way. So over 200 companies, I think it's 208 now, the biggest brands in the world. So it's AWS, Google, Meta, Microsoft. We've got 85 co-location companies. It's good company. But I really want to go with what Joe was saying. We are actually adjusting RFPs, specs, and contracts. There's a disconnect between procurement and engineering. That leap will move us very fast and put our money where our mouth is, right? The buying power behind it. So I would say anybody that's not part of the Climate Accord, you should go take a look at it. climateaccord.org. It is free to get in. It's a pledge. You're basically going back to drive down carbon inside of digital infrastructure. And all of us together, we definitely will be able to make an impact and accelerate that timeline.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. I'll open it up for a question or two. If anyone has any, please do raise your hand.
Hi, I have a question for Josh. If you could elaborate a little more on your on-site cement and aggregate production.
So that was just luck. It was great. When we look for a location, we look for Goldilocks, the right amount of power, adjacent fiber, or we build our giant Q-loop fiber system. It's the biggest ever built. Next door to us is a mine being mined by Vulcan Materials Supply, and it's owned by Argos, which is one of the biggest cement producers in the world. So for them, they can mine the aggregate right there and produce the cement right there.
So you had locally limestone, basically, right?
Local limestone directly mined across the street from us. Yeah, so that was just luck.
Because I thought it was something along the lines of Blue Planet, Dean Nelson can refer to, where they actually have a capability of producing aggregate by sequestering carbon dioxide. Okay.
Exactly. A really cool thing for us, we have 150,000 tons in a landfill of waste material from second pot linings from the aluminum smelter. It's a primary precursor for cement. So all we have to do is take that landfill, which we really obviously don't want because we have to maintain that. Now it can be produced, made into cement, brought right back across the street and turned into buildings. So talk about full carbon and life cycle and a waste management life cycle as well. We're really proud to be able to do that.
Thank you for your question. I think that's it. But thank you so much for joining us. Please do look at the Climate Accord. And any questions, don't hesitate to grab the guys. So thank you again. And thank you to the panel.